So representatives of the National Planning Commission, senior national and local government officials, as well as traditional authorities present here, representatives from the private sector and the business community, our distinguished panelists, other esteemed guests from the academia, NGOs, think tanks, and the donor community present here, ladies and gentlemen here today, and that they are joining us here live in Malawi after crazy years of coronavirus, and all of the ones that are joining us online. Good morning and actually welcome. It is my privilege to be here with you today to launch the Malawi Pathways to Prosperity case study. My name is Maria Jose Sanchez Arrieta. I am the head of the In-Country Prosperity Program at the Legatum Institute. And actually, you're going to need to bear with me for a while today. So I'm going to be your host. And for me, it's a real pleasure, and as well as for the Institute, to be here to talk about how actually Malawi can really transform since, I mean, there was this promise in 1994, but it seems it haven't been fully fulfilled. So how we can actually transform and make Malawi thrive and achieve a prosperous status. First of all, we would like to thank the National Planning Commission for the support that they have given us in this engagement, although I need to highlight that the opinions in the report are for the personal opinions from the Legatum Institute, and they don't necessarily represent the opinions of the National Planning Commission. Additionally, I would like to thank the Templeton World Charity Foundation and the Legatum Foundation for their sponsorship, our support. For those who are not familiar with our work, the Legatum is a global policy think tank based in London that has as an ambitious mission to create pathways from poverty to prosperity. And in order to do that, we would like to actually focus on inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people. Our work really focuses on not just looking at prosperity, but how we can actually achieve that prosperity, and once that is achieved, how we can maintain it, so in order all people can flourish. At the core of our work, you can see the Legatum Prosperity Index. This is a global index that, that we use as one of our flagship initiatives, and we have been measuring prosperity for the last 15 years to over 160 countries. And this really supports our data-driven approach to policies and support the development journey of countries. But prosperity for us is much more than wealth and economic growth. Prosperity for us is when everyone has the opportunity to thrive and have a life well lived. Therefore, I would like to show you a video that actually shows what we mean when we talk about prosperity.
Prosperity is much more than mere wealth or economic growth. True prosperity is when all people have the opportunity Prosperity is much more than mere wealth or economic growth. True prosperity is when all people have the opportunity to thrive. In a prosperous society, people live in peace, free from the threat of violence, oppression, and crime. Everyone's inherent dignity is respected, and all are free to vote, to protest, and to follow their beliefs. Governing institutions in every sector act with truth and integrity, and are subject to the rule of law. And there are stable families and supportive communities that instill the values that shape the culture and build the bonds of trust needed for society to flourish. Prosperity is driven by an open economy that harnesses ideas and talent to foster employment and productivity and create sustainable pathways out of poverty. In a prosperous nation, open markets and high-quality infrastructure facilitate trade and commerce. There is a strong investment environment and effective business regulation that enables entrepreneurship, competition, and innovation. And people have the opportunity to work, to earn, to save, to take risks, and to succeed. Prosperity is built by empowered people who choose to live in right relationship with one another and create a society in which everybody is able to build a life free from poverty. People take care of their physical and mental well-being and can rely on a healthcare system that will take care of them when they need it. Learning is valued and everyone receives a high-quality education so they can write their own futures. And the natural environment is stewarded wisely as a legacy for present and future generations. Prosperity means everyone has the opportunity and freedom to fulfill their unique potential and take responsibility for contributing to their communities and nations. Because ultimately, prosperity is not just what we have on the outside. It is also about who we become on the inside. True prosperity is a life well lived.
Indeed, a life well lived, but how can we ensure and measure what it actually means, a life well lived? And that's why we have tried to root in our prosperity framework. Here we highlight that in order for a country to arrive to this prosperous journey, the country needs to have a strong and needs to have inclusive societies that has strong institutions free of corruption and state capture. Additionally, we need to have open economies that allow entrepreneurs and businesses from all sizes and types to be part of the economy. And at the same time, empower people that can flourish and contribute with their own work to the well-being of the entire society. So you can see here that we have the three main domains and we have 12 pillars that are actually showcasing what do we conceive in one of these ones. And additionally, we have 67 elements. This is what we have been measuring for the last 15 years, and this is at the core of our foundation. But now, without further ado, and hoping that this report is gonna contribute to the discussion in how we can achieve a prosperous Malawi, I would like to welcome Dr. Stephen Brien to talk about Malawi's ranking and the findings of our report. So please, Stephen.
Thank you, Maria Jose, and thank you all esteemed guests for attending this morning. We're looking forward to the panel discussion as well. So, over the last 9 months, we have been working to produce this report, which you all have on your desks, and the full version of the report is also available online. Now, we drafted this report on the back of a number of dimensions of analysis and research. Obviously, given Malawi 2063 as the long-term vision for the country and the immediate plan, MIP1, to show how the next decade is going to progress, that provided a context for us to say, here is the nation's vision, here are its immediate plans to progress against that vision. But we wanted to help and to support by looking at this challenge through the lens of the Prosperity Index to see how we could identify what will it take for not only Malawi to be middle income, as we see in the brochures, but also mid-prosperity. Because at one level, in order to be a sustainably middle-income country, you're also going to have to make sure that the country is mid-prosperity, i.e. all the components that Maria Jose was talking about that underpin wealth generation are also need to be in secure foundations. So governance, open economies, property rights, education, and so forth. Without all of these working in harmony, that vision of middle income and ultimately higher levels will not be sustainable. So in addition to looking at Vision 2063 and looking at MIP1, we also went back to our own analysis and said, let's look at where Malawi sits across the 12 pillars of the Prosperity Index, and indeed, as Maria Jose mentioned, the 67 underlying elements. And this provides us something akin to a DNA fingerprint. Where is Malawi relatively strong? Where is Malawi relatively weak? And therefore, if we're thinking in terms of middle income or middle prosperity, where are the areas that most need effort to improve? Where are the areas that Malawi has a strong base to build upon? So that's what this chart here shows. And quick look at it says mid-prosperity will be around 80th or so in the ranking. And Malawi is currently 129th overall. And looking here, we would see, social capital. That seems to be a bit of a challenge, 157th. If we want to sustain prosperity in the long run, then we're going to need to do some work in that area. What does that mean? We could get into that. On the other hand, when we look at personal freedom at 85th, or governance even at 80th, there's some real positions of strength there that can be used to cornerstone the rest of the development program. So on the back of that, on the back of having a very productive trip here to the country earlier in the year with the support of the Planning Commission, and thank you, Salim, and also engaged with many other experts, both online and in person, we have built up our sense of our diagnostic for the country, and hence, given the current plans of the government, where do we think they need to be strengthened to further make sure progress is sustained? So I think our first take is not going to be a radically new one. Indeed, we have shamelessly borrowed a phrase that has been used a number of times before to say, Malawi has experienced a transition without transformation. And indeed, as we look through the 15 years of the Prosperity Index and tracking 300 variables, we see that over that time period, there has not been the step change that perhaps democracy and the hope of democracy in '94 would have given people those expectations. So really, one of the things that we have to ask ourselves as we go forward is there enough being done differently in the plans and the expectations to engender that step change? But when we look at the underlying challenges, we're seeing low agricultural productivity, low levels of diversification, very much a monocrop culture, and irrigation, mostly rain-fed. So again, very dependent on the weather as opposed to having more advanced irrigation. And then huge urban-rural disparities and a lack of rural development in terms of the commercialization and the business environment in the rural areas. And then when we think about government, localization was on the agenda from '98 onwards. But when we look at, again, the urban-rural divide in terms of capacity of local government, we see that the decentralization of administrative functions and of revenue has not borne fruit in the way there were those expectations. And then finally, coming most centrally perhaps into Lilongwe and Blantyre and other big cities, we see the urban elite having a probably disproportionate economic and political power. And our sense is that that nexus between the sort of urban economic elite and the government is constraining the ability of the nation as a whole to provide broad-based prosperity. And we'll come back to that later on as well. But I know, and I certainly know from having driven around the last day or two looking at what's happening, there are some really pressing, urgent challenges that the government and the nation are facing. And we can't ignore these because they do set the context within which policy can operate. Clearly, given everything that's happening geopolitically and through some of the history, there's a Forex challenge. We see the fuel crisis. Malawi is certainly not alone in experiencing that, but it is quite dramatic to see the lines of cars waiting and that sort of thing. There are massive inefficiencies when you see that. Low fiscal headroom, so a government that is facing this challenge of not having huge room to maneuver. And a really sort of classic case that we have certainly seen in many countries where there's this sort of political economic dilemma. The people who do have the wealth are generally politically powerful, and it's very hard to tax them any more than you manage to do so. And the people, the broad-based community, simply is not generating enough economic activity to provide resources that are able to be taxed. So you've got this dilemma. The wealth is over there, but it's very difficult to tax it, and the mass of the population economic activity is not commercialized enough to provide a tax base. Hence, the government gets squeezed in a bit of a trap. And as a result of that happening over a number of years, there's a mounting debt challenge. So this is difficult. This is a thorny issue to get out of. And as we go through the report, what I'd like you to think about is, how will we establish, in effect, a taxable economy? There's one thing to say, I want to tax the economy today, but if the economy is not taxable, there isn't going to be huge value in trying to pluck the last feather out of the goose. We need to think about how to create an economy that is commercialized, is broad-based, and therefore there is a broad tax base to draw from that then creates that virtuous cycle with the government. So before we get into the details, as we wrote the conclusion to the report, we recognized that in effect there were 4 big themes running through the specifics that I think are harkening back to that idea of how do you create a taxable economy. Now, if we think about smallholder farmers, entrepreneurs, Malawians in general, but if we think about those people who are in this sort of non-commercialized economy at the moment, greater productivity is clearly the starting point. But to do that, our sense is there are 4 ideas that are worth keeping in mind, so running themes throughout this. One is to create greater levels of connection. There are high degrees of what we call atomization in Malawian society. Farmers on their own, subsistence workers over here on their own. The level of interaction, sort of commercial, economic, social interaction is not high enough. The opportunity to do deals, to trade, to share with each other, to help each other is too low. So how do we help draw those connections? It can be by improving roads, by doing other things, but think about how do we go from an atomized society of subsistence farmers and other smallholders and small commercial operations into a networked economy where everybody's trading and supporting with each other. And then how do we make it more incorporated? So the idea of focusing primarily on farming or working for household consumption shifts into a world where we're saying, I'm actually running a business, and that business can be identified. That's my business, and I make money out of that business, and I then use that resources to pay for and support my family. But disconnecting and creating this concept of an enterprise that stands alone, separate from, as it were, the family, is really helpful and important, because actually if we want to start creating a tax base, we need these enterprises. These enterprises have to exist to be taxed. And not that I'm obsessing here about tax, but what I am obsessing about is an economy that has structure to it, that has form to it, and that is moving to a system of companies, employment, trade, commerce that's quite different from where we are today. And then the next big theme drawing together is aggregation. Moving from sole traders, moving from family farms to organizations that are more aggregated, that can share costs, that can share marketing, that can join marketing campaigns together to sell their goods, that can come together to buy equipment or rent equipment together. And therefore, out of that, a surplus starts to appear. And greater degrees of organizational capacity are critical, whether that's cooperatives or other forms of organization. And then the final theme is to move from a sort of inward-looking, survival approach to saying there's a big world out there, whether it's regional commerce or international commerce, as we were talking earlier about the trade fair in Blantyre just earlier last week. These are the mindset shifts that we need to find a route, find the champions who are already doing it, and create that as being the norm. So these are 4 ideas I'd like you to keep in your mind as we work through the specific recommendations. And then the recommendations that we've built out, and these are very much intended to be, how do we build on MIP1? It's not to say change that, but as we go through, can we strengthen it? Can we emphasize areas that we think really will make a difference? So 6 areas that we're going to walk through. One is around agricultural productivity. and locally led economic growth? How do we start to create that sense that within towns and villages we can create a bit of an economic dynamo? To support that, we need infrastructure at a district level, local roads, locally managed infrastructure, remote access for energy, water, irrigation, and so forth. And then if you've got that engine going of agricultural productivity, local commercial energy, how do we then create the environment in which we can have international trade? So we've got, and I'm looking at a few people around here, farmers who have built up their own farm, added value processing, now need to get goods to market. That's going to help address the Forex problem if we can increase that level of exporting. And then you pick up the bigger economy and say, okay, if I've got all this working, and I look at the health of the economy, particularly say more at an urban level, I'm starting to see issues that are around property rights, slightly more abstract issues around property rights, government contracting, how SOEs work. And that becomes the next level of the challenge to sort out. And then finally, the two other areas that we're going to quickly look at is around decentralization, the need to actually push power and opportunity out to the regions, and also thinking about political reform. Primarily, the theme here in our mind, the big idea is around making sure that the rural communities and farmers have a stronger political voice in the centre, so that their interests are part of the political debate and can stand, as it were, side by side with the strong economic interests of the business elite. So I'll quickly counter through these six ideas. One, promoting agricultural productivity. This, of course, is the big priority. We would encourage, and I know that MIP1 is starting to work on this, shifting from input subsidy from fertilizers and so forth into saying we need to invest in productivity. We need to work out the different things that have to get sorted out. Simply saying that lack of fertilizer is the big problem misses the fact that in different parts of the country there are different issues, and we need to be able to work, and that's why localization is pretty important, to be able to work out, okay, what type of extension services do we need? Some places will need fertilizer, some places will need other things. So you're focusing on how do I create agricultural productivity? How do I drive commercialization of agriculture? And also, small-scale local irrigation is probably needed to complement the large-scale plans that are existing. And then, again, at a local level, how can I bring farms together to create cooperatives, to create that scale that will provide a surplus? And then perhaps this is a challenge, an opportunity for the development partners to de-risk commercial loans, to find a way of getting capital to farmers, and perhaps using some development funding as a de-risking mechanism. So imagine this brave world. We've got farming productivity on the upward. We now need to make sure that goods can get to market, that the value-add processing that's needed has the resources such as water, electricity, and so forth, so that plants and processing can operate. And also, the other thing that we spotted, and I've seen this in a few other countries as well, that the logistics market, which tends to be much more capital intensive, has been consolidated into a small number of firms. And I think this is probably a government issue to break up that logistics market, encourage greater competition and variety of logistics, because actually getting goods to market, from farms to market, and from regional centres internationally is a critical piece of this puzzle. And at the moment, when you look at comparative costs for transport within and between Malawi and other countries, disproportionately high versus more successful neighbours. Okay, so now we've got this idea of we've got the transport, we've got the production in place. Next thing to do is to make sure that the goods are able to be exported. So national quality and export standards should be more aligned to international markets, so that we're not in a position of having multiple confusing standards. We'd strongly encourage the development of an export promotion agency from Malawi to think beyond just agricultural products, to really promote Malawian exports, and thinking through border administration, export bans, etc., so that the physicality of moving goods through borders, the certainty that there won't be a ban on exports, so that people can build up businesses, invest for export, and know that they will not get caught short. Now, of course, The reason for these export bans, I can recognize as being very understandable, but that's where the agricultural productivity is so important, so that you're not in a position of saying, we've got to keep all the maize in-house, because actually there is more getting produced in the first place. Now, moving into a world where we then have exports working, you start to say, okay, there are higher order problems. These are probably not the most urgent ones. I think those first three, getting that value chain from agricultural productivity to the infrastructure to exporting, that chain is probably the most critical thing. But it would be good to reduce price distortions in the utility sector so that the utility companies are getting the right marginal cost for their investments and for their delivery. Opening up government contracting to make markets more contestable, professionalizing the management of state-owned enterprises, and reforming land allocation. And in particular as well, one-stop shops for supporting businesses, so that this idea of incorporation, this idea of setting up a business is very easy and natural, and it's not a burden that people have to go to 23 different places, but it just becomes, yes, it's easy to incorporate. And you don't grab money and don't tax people immediately, but build up that sense of a set of incorporated businesses, and you start to get the basis of an economy. Now, two last ones, one on decentralization. This is, I think, the missed opportunity, the area where we probably, through our interviews, heard some of the greatest disappointment. The fact that there are so many different regional issues, different regional challenges. There seems to be a big asymmetry and disconnect between expectations of what regional district authorities have to do, the funding afforded to them, the sort of capacities they have. This won't get sorted out overnight, but if we're going to sort out and work out which rural roads need to be remediated, work out what are the different farming challenges in different places, running everything out of Lilongwe will only get us so far. We need the eyes and ears on the ground, but we need the accountable eyes and ears on the ground, people who feel accountable to their local community and are empowered to act. So this is where I would think for these areas, push it to local authorities as much as possible. And then over time, build up the capacity. And I think that's really important, that this is an important challenge, but one that has to be done in phases. Then finally, on the area of political accountability, again, as an outsider looking in at the history of Malawi, we saw very good moves in '94. We saw again in 2019 with the election being annulled and rerun. The idea of the rule of law, the judiciary establish themselves as being clearly independent is a great strength and needs to be built on. However, having talked to quite a number of people, it is clear there's still quite a high degree of corruption in the system. That needs to be worked through. Our experience in looking at other countries where that has been successful is, yes, you need a strong anti-corruption bureau, but actually the real trick is to design corruption out of the system, remove the opportunities for corruption by automating, by removing discretion, and things like that, that basically eliminate those opportunities, is a far more effective way of structurally changing than just on its own adding more teeth to the Anti-Corruption Bureau. State capacity, the ability of the government to deliver complex sets of services throughout the entire country, needs to be built up. And our sense here, again, looking at benchmarks of countries that have been successful on this journey, is to find a few islands of excellence, find the key areas that are absolutely critical to have high quality, really focus on getting the capacity, the right selection process for civil servants, the right mentoring, training, and career development for them working, the right values, and then build out from those islands of success. Because these areas can be a beacon for everybody else, where it's trying to, as it were, steadily lift the entire civil service up slowly, has generally found itself to be quite ineffective in many other countries. So think about the island of success. You can contain it, you can get great leaders in, and build out from there. But the big thing that we've experienced as we've traveled the country, talked to small business leaders, talked to bigger business leaders, is this sense of the asymmetry of political power, that the rural voice is not being heard. At the end of the day, with 80% of the population engaged in agriculture, engaged in the rural community, the policies the government thinks about, the focus of the mind has to be predominantly on this group of people and how to increase their productivity, how to bring them into the system, how to connect them that we were talking about. And before I finish, I'd like to show you a short video that we pulled together over the weekend as we went out and said, okay, so what are the aspirations, what are the hopes of people in the countryside, and what do we here need to be thinking about? What do we need to have in our minds as we build out policies?
Ndino Olivera Zefenia ndimakhala mudzi mwa Sumbi ti Mazengera. Ntchito limagwira yokumba miyala ngati silichi. Tili magulu angapo amene limagwira ntchito imeneyi.
Dzina langa ndi Rashid Emmanuel Maduga, ndimakhala mudzi mwa Nzazi ti Mazengera. Kudzazana nde tikamafuna kupeza miyala iyi timagwira ntchito kusefa. Timasefa dotija mumadzi ochuluka pamene tatha kulenga dotija kupita pamalo ena ake pamene pali madzi ochuluka tikuyamba kusefa. Ndeti miyala tija tikasefa tikakhala timichenga rokharoka pamene timapezamo miyala ya imene tikufuna kuti tipeze ndalama zotithandizire ngati makomo athu, mabanja athu.
Ngati pagulu mavuto amene timakumana nawo, mwina timakumana ndi mavuto osiyanasiyana ngati imene timagwirira ntchitomo. Komanso ngati pa gulu la ndekha ndimafuna mwina pakhomo panga patatuluka, komanso ana wanga ataphunzira kuti akhale ndi moyo otsogola.
Okay, chifukwa chakusowa ndalama komabe malingaliro amakhala pofuna kupita patsogolo, makamakaso nkhani yokhudza ulimi imatipulirapo ifa yoti ulimi umakhuzananso kupeza ndalama mochuluka. Komano kunoko tikamapeza ndalamazi timapeza kuti tungodyeratu.
Ife chimene tingachite ngati kutukula miyoyo ya mudzi mwathu ndi kuthandiza osazi zathu ovutika. Komanso ndi kutukula mabanja athu, komanso kwa ana athu, komanso ena ovutika amene mwina sangathe kugwira ntchito ngati imene.
Tikhoza kuwauza kuti atithandizire ngati kumabungwe kapena kuti makamaka tikhoza kuti mabungwe amene amadziwa kuthandiza kwa anthu amene akuvutika chifukwa chosowa thandizo, makamaka amene akugwira ntchito koma ntchito zawozo sizikuwapindulira. Ndiye ngati kumakhala kotheka akhoza kutipanga chotheka kuti ifeyo ntchito zathu tikamagwira tizikhala ndi chiyembekezo china chake.
Pagulu likhoza panga business, bodi ma business yosiyanasiyana. Ena mwina kugula makina, ena mathamanga ndi mageni, ena umodo zisalu, thandizo ndi business.
Kozo kawo sanga wambiri kozo na uli masompi nyanga amene mafanta figira bomba irapo kanthu anthandiza ndi kozo kawo sanga wambiri modi so banja langa kozo kawo sanga anthu ena ndikhoza kuwauza kuti mukakhala olimbikira ena othandiza amadzera mmene mukulimbikiramo ndipo amatha kuthandizana, ndipo mukhale olimbikira ntchito kuti ena akafuna kuthandizana.
Ine chimandibweretsera chimwemwe chimene lingaliro langa nditapeza kuti pakhomo panga pali mtendere wa chuma kapena business.
Okay, so Malawi 2063 is about ensuring that by 2063 this community's life is very different in a positive way. I would contend that if we come back to our themes, let's think about it for this community. How do we help them get more connected? So we heard that other than the stone merchants, we were the only outsiders to have connected with them in a long time. So if this community is going to be socially included, if this community is going to be economically wealth generating and have good well-being, they're going to have to be a lot more connected with all the people that they want to trade with, engage with, buy services from, add value to. And that includes politics. So you heard there's a plea for help, for engagement. They are not yet participating in the debate. They need to be. They need to be more incorporated. So think about, imagine they had a business between them. Imagine there was a little sort of, stone sifting Inc. in that village that was run as a business that they could all be working in and started running some accounts, keeping track of things. Think about what that could do in terms of start of an economy. And then more aggregated. Imagine if we took a series of these villages that are all basically engaging in the same type of activity, aggregated into a cooperative, got them marketing, got them thinking through what equipment do we need, how could we become more efficient? And then more outward looking. Why are the stone merchants coming to them and they not adding value, not being able to capture any of the value that goes further down the chain? How do we help them think, okay, I could be going to market, I could be trading, I could be adding value, I could aggregate, get a little bit of capital, do some shining, some polishing, whatever is needed. I could be selling this on. So they're thinking, where are their export markets? So think about this group of people and how these ideas of greater connectivity, incorporation, aggregation, outward looking could make a massive difference to their lives. And I put it to you, that's what Malawi 2063 needs to be about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for sharing with us the insights, and we are really looking forward to unpack this more in the forward panel discussion. But for now, I would like to invite to the stage our keynote speaker, Dr. Thomas Munthali, Director General of the National Planning Commission.
Right. I will not say good morning because usually people don't respond when you say that. But I wish you a good morning. So it doesn't matter whether you respond or not. I want to recognize the colleagues from Legatam Institute, Stephen, Maria, Juan, at the back there, and indeed the colleagues that are forming the panel this morning. My brother Henry, Prof. Nandini Patel, nice to see you after a long time, and Ngabaghila, Chatata. I also recognize in the room some very familiar faces, and thanks CEO for MITC, my brother Paul for being with us, as well as Prof. Madise from AFIDIP. And many other faces. I recognize my brother, the head of economics department, and the Mapata colleagues here, and so many other colleagues that are gathering with us, senior government officials here present. I also, in a very special way, want to recognize the colleagues that are online and that are watching with us this morning. By the way, Ngabaghila is a champion of the Malawi 2063's first pillar of agricultural productivity and commercialization. So a very well-deserved recognition. You see, if we recall, on 19th of last year, we launched the vision for the nation, collectively led by the head of state. And the vision is clear and straightforward. We desire to have an inclusively wealthy and self-reliant nation. I think the short of it is that we want to be a prosperous nation. So the pathways to prosperity talk to what we desire as a nation. And also realizing that talk is cheap, that any vision that doesn't have an action plan is just a dream. We came up with the first 10-year implementation plan, which has two key main milestones. And this is what you see on that banner. First, we want to graduate this country into a low middle income economy by 2030. But also during the same period, we want to make sure that we meet most of the sustainable development goals, this being the last decade of action. In making ourselves to be an inclusively wealthy nation, in other words, for us to be a prosperous nation, we agreed as a nation that we're going to achieve this through three main ways. In other words, three interlinked pillars. We agreed to have our agriculture to be largely commercialized and productive. Secondly, we agreed that we're going to make sure that we industrialize. Thirdly, as we said, we need to urbanize. I'm being given a note, I don't know what's inside. Oh, I'm being reminded, how could I forget that? That, by the way, how can you forget that Dr. Chingaipe is also a champion of the Malawi 2063 under governance? And that's a scene that I could have paid for, because Dr. Chingaipe also sits in one of the board committees of the National Planning Commission, so I could easily have lost my job. So Dr. Chingaipe, a clap for hands of him as well. And so when we're talking about agricultural productivity and commercialization, there are a number of things in there, and I'm happy that Stephen was talking to some of these issues very directly. We are talking of making sure that our agriculture becomes more irrigated. I mean, we have more irrigation. At the moment, it's a very low percentage. We're talking about 19% of the land that's being irrigated. We want to move that to around 60% come 2030. And want to increase at least the proportion of the exports that are other than tobacco, in other words, diversification, to move to below 40% to 60% by the year 2030. And I think those of you who know that our agriculture is pretty much, I mean, our economy is pretty much agrarian based, so any prosperity that we talk about, the springboard will be agriculture. Because 90% of the export earnings come from agriculture. Actually, it contributes 30% of the GDP in this country. And so when you come next to the issue of industrialization, we've said, look, mining should also be a key component. And we ask ourselves the question, mining for what? We don't want to be mining for the sake of sending raw. We want to beneficiate right here and make sure that the fertilizers we produce, the steel that we produce, and all that we have to be importing is done here. We've got the minerals that it takes for us to get there. So we want to move from the current levels of mining, which is less than 1%, to around 10% come 2030. And we know this is very much possible. It's just actually a modest figure, because we can get more than that. But we also recognize that manufacturing is too low. In this country, we used to manufacture quite a lot. Those of you that are old enough will recognize how we had Makata Industrial Site in Blantyre, where we could manufacture all sorts of things. That is all gone because of liberalization, which means we need to begin to build our capacities, productive capacities back, both in terms of policy as well as the hard infrastructure. Because the 12% contribution of manufacturing to GDP currently is too low. When we're talking about urbanization as our last pillar, as I said, these are interlinked. We want to make sure that the current cities that we're sitting in are world-class cities. And that's why you're seeing a lot of work around the 6 lanes, around all this infrastructure happening, around the city center and so on, in the quest to make sure that we make our cities, the current cities, to be world-class. By the way, you might wish to know that 40% of our GDP in Malawi comes simply from the 4 cities that we have, which tells you that the more you urbanize, the more you are contributing to your GDP. Our tourism is so low, it's part of the urbanization agenda. We want to push it from around 7% that it is at the moment to at least something that comes to 12% by 2030. Because we recognize as well that creating of tourism hubs is very central for the wealth creation that will propel the pathways to prosperity. But we also were quick as a nation to realize that for us to make wealth through those 3 interlinked pillars, there have to be some key enablers, 7 of them. And one was to say we need a mindset change. because we need to begin to believe in ourselves a lot more. And the value system that we need to have is one that is linked to a nation that is ready for wealth creation and being self-reliant. A hardworking nation, a nation that loves integrity, hates corruption and handouts, is united and peaceful. Those values have to be inculcated right all the way from the curriculums that we have in our early child development centers, primary schools, all the way up, and then making sure that those of us who cannot be taught new tricks because we are old are given the stick and carrot, that we conform. And then we're talking about making sure that we have effective governance systems and institutions. We just have to begin to hold ourselves more accountable. And those institutions that are there have to do their job in that regard. Then we also have, and I think Stephen has talked about it, the effective public sector performance. We know that if we do not have a good public service that is offering quality, private investments, levels, and speed will not be as we expect. And that takes us to the fourth one, which is private sector dynamism. When we talk about private sector dynamism, it is to say that our laws, our strategies, our policies, our macroeconomic environment should talk to what the private sector needs. If our laws and our policies are off-mark the wealth creation agenda, that squarely which primarily has to be done by the private sector, then we are losing the plot. Meaning, we have to effectively engage the private sector when we're developing laws and policies for this nation. So they're in line. Talking of which, by the way, in Malawi, some of us argue that we don't have a private sector. The market failures are huge, which means we come back to our developmental state philosophy. The state has to play some role, but in strong alliance with the private sector. So that over time, once we begin to see that there are investments happening in the various sectors of the economy, the state needs to pull out and sell those shares to Malawians. Then we create a cadre of Malawians that are wealthy. So bringing that back, the likes of the Malawi Development Corporation is something that is on the cards. And making sure that the Agricultural Development Marketing Corporation is reformed to be a commercialized, fit-for-purpose institution is also on the cards. We need to have it as a viable commercial entity that is a huge aggregator for both domestic and external markets. Human capital development is another aspect. We need to have a fit-for-purpose human resource in this nation. Matter of fact, now we are doing a skills audit in conjunction with the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Labor. The point being that we want to ask ourselves, do we have what it takes in terms of skill sets to meet the Malawi 2063 aspirations? And so that we begin to develop them now for what we need in 2030 and 2063. And that process is in the offing. Along with that is we're making serious reflections and putting in place strategies, and I'm happy that AFIDEP is here with us, in making sure that our population is the quality that we need to deliver on the vision aspirations. We want to make sure that we harness the demographic dividend that we have as a nation, while making sure that we can have time to sleep. I think especially men, let's take time to sleep a bit more, because it seems we're not sleeping, so we're manufacturing babies too much. Or is it the other way around? Maybe it's the women that are provoking us not to sleep. But whichever the case, I think what we're saying is children by choice, not by accident. Then, last but one is economic infrastructure. We need to make sure that our economic infrastructure is sound, that we have the transport networks that connect the productive centers to the markets. And we have to make sure that our energy is in abundance, but also affordable. And lastly, that our ICT creates a digital economy that we need. Lastly is environmental sustainability on the enablers. For us to be a prosperous nation in creating the pathways to prosperity, if we lose track of our environment, it will affect us big time, especially given that we still are relying on agriculture at the moment. So whatever happens to the environment throws us offside completely with regard to food security, economy, energy generation, and everything else. Why am I having to waste all this time? Because there is convergence in terms of what the Legatam Institute is propagating here and what we already have in our vision. Matter of fact, the Malawi 2063 First 10-Year Implementation Plan has clearly outlined the flagship projects and catalytic interventions that we need to put in place for us to meet the aspirations of an inclusively wealthy and self-reliant nation. But what I like about what the Legatam Institute has done this morning is that they're beginning to tease off the specifics of what we need to be looking at. And I think the more we talk generalities, the more we're not going to get anywhere. We need to begin to talk specifics of what needs to happen. And thereafter, I have candid conversations and engagement with authorities that are going to be dealing with those issues. And that's why I'm excited this morning that we have such non-state actors as Legatam Institute, because we need such that are adding value based on evidence-based advisory. So that when we are moving forward, and if we can have a number of you guys, you'll always be sitting on our high table. Because we want to make sure that we move together in operationalizing the vision. What we're talking about moving forward is not about talking about generalities, but what will move us into action. We need more of actioning. So, with that, I want to say finally that, when you look at Malawi, it is developing. But it's the pace that is worrisome. We can accelerate it. And basically, I think I sometimes pick out 4 key aspects that make us to delay. First, exogenous shocks. Currently, for example, you have COVID-19. You had the cyclones like Anna. You have now the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and there are more others on the sidelines. I always contend that the difference between us and the developed countries is not because they don't face exogenous shocks, but they are more prepared to handle exogenous shocks. Why? They've got the tools, they've got the buffer resources that when these hit, they can look into their hallways and grab some resources. And they actually have enabling tools that can foretell them sometimes ahead of time of what's going to happen. That foresighting capabilities is what we need more as a nation. So having buffer resources puts a strong resolve for us to make sure that we indeed create wealth and put aside some resources that we can draw on if we need support. For example, Kapichira, if we had buffer resources, we didn't need to wait for the World Bank to give us a loan and then go through all those procurement processes that take long. If we had a buffer resource stock somewhere, it was just an issue of drawing on that resource, put the power back online, and then you move on. Exogenous shocks, which links to the point of capacities. So we don't have the capacities. It's quite challenging both at the central and decentralized levels how much lack of capacities exist. So you have ministries, departments, and agencies that know their mandates, but they hardly have got the resources, both technical, human resource, and otherwise to execute the mandates. Which means we need to develop, it puts our resolve again strong. We need to create wealth so that we support those MDAs to coordinate the implementation of the programs. The other aspect is accountability. I think for a long time we have not been holding each other accountable. We leave things to go willy-nilly. If somebody doesn't do their part, even given the little resources that they have, sometimes the best they do is to transfer them between departments and ministries. Accountability systems not just in the public sector, but even in the private sector. As Malawians, we like talking, and then we don't even hold each other accountable. And I think the last but big elephant in the room again is corruption. So when you talk about wealth creation, no matter how much wealth we're going to create, it will not lead to paths to prosperity if that money just drains down through corruption. And we're excited that I think efforts are beginning to show up and we have to give credit when it is due. I think we may not be there yet, but I think the authorities are trying to make sure that they deal with corruption issues in this country. And this is a role that each one of us needs to play a part in, because as I say, it takes two to tango. It's not just about government, leaving this to government alone. Now, in conclusion, I believe that Malawi can be one of the rising stars of Africa. We've got what it takes. If we can deal with the issues that I just talked about, the issues that Stephen and Tim are talking about, the pathways to prosperity, we should be one of the rising stars. We've had about 15 countries in Africa, until COVID-19 hit, they are growing at 5% above every year consistently. And we should be part of that as Malawi, part of those rising economies of Africa. So, my message to you, Legatum, if you help us to get to the 2 milestones of being a low middle income economy by 2030 and meeting most of the SDGs, we'll organize a Legatum party in 2030. And I'm sure Steve will be there. Otherwise, just like Liverpool, you'll never walk alone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Munthali, for those candid and actually open remarks. I think that I would like to, before we move on, I would like to highlight that I think it's quite relevant to see the convergences of what we're talking about, and that indeed, in order to actually fulfill the promises from 1994 to pass from democratization to a real transformation, what we need is to put policies into action and to actually start working and doing what we preach and what we plan for. Without further ado, I would like to invite my 4 panelist stars to the stage. Dr. Henry Chingaipe, Director and Lead Consultant at the Institute Policy Research and Social Empowerment, and of course, Malawi 26-3 Effective Governance Champion. Chatata, Managing Director and Founder of Thanthwe Farmers, and also a champion in the agricultural commercialization piece, Dr. Nandini Patel, founding member, chairperson of the Institute for Policy Interaction, and associate professor at Catholic University, and of course, Salim Mapila, who has been my partner in crime during these 9 months to develop the report, development planning specialist at the National Planning Commission. Please, welcome. Well, is this working out? Perfect. So first of all, I think that I would like to start with Dr. The democratic transition in '94 came with hopes, a lot of hopes, expectations. But almost after 30 years, the economic performance is nowhere you want it to be today. Can you maybe develop this idea and unpack this and see what have been the main challenges?
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, 1992, 93, 94, we began a project of hope and promise in terms of democracy and development. When I think about it, I think it's been the same 2 objectives that also inspired the struggle for independence. People wanted better governance by themselves, and they wanted prosperity in terms of socioeconomic development. And in the 90s, it was also the same. And today, close to 30 years after the transition, we're looking back, And when you speak to Malawians, when you look at different analyses, they are still looking for the same things: better governance and socioeconomic development. So when we look at our history, what we see is a persistent inability of the leadership at various levels to actually deliver democratic governance and socioeconomic development simultaneously. And I want to underline the word simultaneously, because when people are talking of the transition without transformation, I think it's too sweeping. I think it's also a little bit unfair, because there has been transformation. But what has not happened is that the transformation is slow, is dismal, perhaps not as meaningful as we would have loved, and also there has been trade-offs. When we have become better in terms of democratic governance, during those periods we have become worse off in terms of socioeconomic development. So it has eluded us as a country how to get democratic governance and socioeconomic development together simultaneously so that we can push the agenda forward. And that's why the transformation is checkered. It's slow here, it's better there. There are reversals as we move from one political regime to another. There is the emphasis on one, the emphasis on the other, and all sorts of interesting but not helpful things that happen that have sort of contributed to the hopes being dampened and some of the promises not being achieved. But let's be fair, something has happened. And I think, as the DG was saying, from the economic side, there has been growth, not consistent and slow, but there has been growth. Maybe we should be raising questions. How have people benefited from that growth? What kind of growth? And I think what we see more is the story that we have had economic growth that has not translated to jobs. And so we need to start asking, why is it that our economic growth doesn't actually result in employment and jobs? Okay, we have had growth that has also gone together with increasing inequalities. So we need to start thinking about how we can make participation in the benefits of growth more inclusive and so on. So I think that's what I would say for a start. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to comment on Dr. report, remarks. If not, I will pass. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Chingaipe. It's quite interesting that he's highlighting that we have, on one hand we are moving, on the other hand we are not. I was trying to understand why, and from a social scientist perspective, what I see is the challenge of we don't know how to manage change. And basically it's like this or that. So when we moved from the one-party system, we just thought the odd was bad. So we dropped everything, like the way we closed all the industries. Then we moved and started thinking that the new has everything in it. So until we start to realize how everything is connected to the other, we are not going to move. And I also was just discussing with Dr. Patel that it's amazing, the panel. This is just a reflection of how we should be moving. We can't move just economically when the political side is not moving. On the other hand, how did it turn out that politically we were moving and then economically we were not? We started seeing people losing jobs. Because on the other hand, there is the principle of functionalism. It became very functional for the political part to have more poor people so that votes can pass. But then at the end of the day, if you have a lot of poor people, it also creates another political problem because people want jobs, people want to eat. So whatever solution we are coming with, we need to be balancing up if Malawi is going to move. So some level of selfishness from the political side led to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and that actually landed really well to the question that I'm going to address to Professor Patel. And on those lines, and in terms of, this is really interesting, better governance and socio-economic development not going together. But I think that this is reflected in terms of the rural participation. So how can we make sure that the interest of over 80% of Malawians that live in rural areas are actually represented?
Thank you very much for your question. Good morning, everyone. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. I agree with both my panelists where they said, no, we are making some progress, but is it balanced? I think that is common everywhere. I think that both democracy and development processes do not go in a linear way. It's an uneven process. One step forward, two steps backwards. That's how it goes everywhere in the world. In Malawi, we have seen so many changes over the 3 decades. And one particular period I often refer to is we saw 5 years of excellent economic growth rate. But that was not sustained because that period saw regression in politics. And then the following term, it was regression both ways. So the question is, how are we going to sustain this even development process? Now, coming to the question of enhancing local participation, yes, there is a big gap between involving the rural communities effectively. But one thing I want to bring out particularly is about decentralization. So much is said about lack of inadequate power sharing. Devolution of power is not happening, and that resources and powers are limited at the local level. But one thing I want to bring to in this forum is in the 1994 Constitution of Malawi, it was supposed to be local government elections to be held a year before the parliamentary and presidential elections. And I thought that made so much sense in terms of really widening the participation for rural communities, opportunity for rural leaders to emerge. And what happened was, until 2001, no local government elections were held. This is something very important that we reflect, that those formative years, there was no scope for local leadership to emerge. And then in 2014, we have the tripartite elections, which to me actually puts the local governance to periphery. And we have seen that we have had problems in conducting tripartite elections, 2014 and again in 2019. If elections are separated, the local government from the other two, electoral process can be efficient, but importantly, local structures can also be enhanced. There will be better leadership, competition, participation, and so on. And another institution which is controversial at the local level is the involvement of the traditional authorities in the political process. I think this has been a very contentious debate. Some saying that they should not be in politics, some say they should be fully involved because they have so much support and authority at the local level. Yes, they are there in the local councils, but my question is, how do we come to some kind of consensus of trying to define the role? And here again, I want to refer to a very important section of the Constitution which was repealed, and that was to have a Senate. To me, Senate made good sense. You have few people, but you make sure that these important institutions of authority are there in the Senate. It was repealed, and there was a constitutional conference in 2007, which was a comprehensive one, and there was overwhelming support to bring back Senate. So I think these are some suggestions that I think we need to look at these, decisions made at the constitutional conferences or series of other conferences, which are all there, very good recommendations, but we have not moved forward with them. I think we need to take this up and have this kind of debate and see how do we make sure that local institutions are fully participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Patel. Any comments, or I can jump to the next question? Yeah, I think I saw that you wanted to comment.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Interesting things in terms of how we think about the rural part of our economy and how we get more people involved in the political process, as it were, through the local government system. My observations, first, I think, taking up from where Professor Nandini left in terms of local government elections. I think that in the 90s, we designed a local government system, and we never actually tested it. We never actually implemented it. Okay? And then, as she said, there were no elections held. Elections were scheduled and postponed for different reasons. At one time, because there was no money. At another time, because the Electoral Commission was closed. At another time, because the country was facing a hunger crisis and it was better to spend money on buying food. At another time, so we can go on to cite all the interesting but perhaps not so cogent reasons why local government elections were postponed. So we carried out an analysis, some kind of a political economy analysis of, why local government elections can't be held. And so we found that there was no traction. The people who run the central government at a political level, at a bureaucratic level, didn't want to actually do the local government system designed and implemented. They were happy with the district councils being field administration systems of the central government. They were happy the political space at the local level being taken over and being managed by traditional leaders. Okay? It was convenient for them for many reasons that I don't have the time to speak to. So I participated in an advocacy strategy, development and implementation, that led us to the tripartite elections. We advocated that the only way we could hold local government elections was actually to hold them together with presidential and parliamentary elections, because the authorities that were putting local government elections at bay were largely parliamentarians and the presidency, but they couldn't postpone their own election. So we must do the local government elections together. And that's how we actually got it in to do tripartite elections. Now, it's creating its own problems, but then we will see how it actually works out going forward. Now, in terms of involving the rural people more, I think that we do need to understand how neoliberal economic policies in the 1990s to early 2000s have actually disseminated the rural economy by destabilizing agriculture, by disorganizing rural markets for agricultural produce, because of a haphazard way of implementing market-oriented policies when society was not ready, when markets were weak, and the state too was weak. Because you do need a particular state in a particular stature and a particular private sector with a particular stature for you to successfully implement and also benefit from neoliberal policies. And those were not part of the conditions that were prevailing at the time we did a haphazard sort of liberalization and all sorts of other ancillary neoliberal economic policies. The state withdrew too quickly, and we hoped private sector would be there to fill the gap, and there was no private sector. Now we have created a system in which producers in the rural economy don't benefit as much from their production. And people who don't produce, the middlemen, the traders, benefit much more than the producers. And so we should not be surprised when we see productivity going down. Because why should people who don't produce benefit more from the production of others? And those who produce are year in, year out, complaining about diminishing returns to their labor.
Thank you so much for that, and that leads me then to Ngaba. Actually, you have a special place because you transitioned from the development sector to actually being an entrepreneur in Malawi. So listening to this debate, I could see how your face was glowing with some of the comments. So what do you think that happened? How hard is to be an entrepreneur in Malawi, and especially in agriculture? How do you see the productivity challenges that Dr. Henry was mentioning, and how we unlock those?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was in the development sector and dealing with poverty all the time. I realized that wasn't adding up. That's what inspired me to go now from the wealth, start to work on the same problem, but from the wealth creation angle. Yeah, it hasn't been easy, but it's worth a while. There are a number of challenges in the space because, as he said, there is no private sector. Basically, the private sector, that system that was there, had collapsed. Of course, it was from the non-state actors, but then at the same time, we basically didn't have the role models to watch, apart from the vision that we had to pursue. But then you also, even if you want to reach out to get the support from the government system, you are coming from an angle where it's new to them as well, so they don't know how to deal with you. Your identity is sort of. So we still pushed because we set ourselves to see a Malawi that is able to grow and export high value agricultural products. And we started from where we could start, farming, but we had already seen wrote a vision that would enable us to reach to the level where we can export. And some of the things that the challenges we had were also what Dr. Munthali was mentioning in terms of the skills. So you want to run a horticultural enterprise, you want to employ the youth from the University of Malawi, but they don't have the practical skills. So these are the realities on the ground. It's like the education system is so theoretical. So when we engage the ones from Luana, so NRC side, they think they know, but when you engage them, they don't understand what you're trying to do. When you engage the ones from Bunda, they think they are managers even before they can attain that. So that's what led us to start now business incubation, because for us, the fact that, okay, actually with my husband, he's a computer scientist, I'm a social scientist. So we had entered uncharted waters. So we had already accepted that we are not agriculturists, so we positioned ourselves to learn. So we learned practically by doing it. So we started now doing business incubation to start to train the youth and give them the right skills so that we have a workforce that can support us. But this is also what we are advocating, because why we went into this is not just for us. As I said, it's for a Malawi that is able to export. We also learned very quickly that it was not going to happen just us alone farming. We needed volumes, so we started working with smallholder farmers. So somehow the social scientist, the extension worker in me applies, but a lot of it we had to learn by doing it. But we also, just to say that later, we started getting support from the Ministry of Agriculture. There are some people that are in a position in those spaces that are also tired and wanting to see the change. So we capitalized on those that had given us positive support, Ministry of Trade, MITC, and now we are really positioned to export. Yeah, so it's been quite a journey.
Thank you so much for those remarks, and this leads me to the question for Salim. How actually the vision is quite solid, but we have the first, like the MIP1, right? How actually MIP1 and the flagship initiatives that you have there and the programs and the interventions that you have identified are addressing these challenges? How are we looking into particular economic development and strengthen governance in a way that includes all Malawians, not leaving anyone behind?
No, and thank you very much. I didn't want to jump the gun when you presented an opportunity for people to, comment. But since I'm from the Commission and we need to allow for as much input as possible. But I think I got interested with the political economic framing of the conversation, just looking at, the evolution of development planning in Malawi and how, there's been gaps, but development planning has been there for a really long time. And if you look at Malawi 2063, essentially that comes from the backdrop of the review that was done of Vision 2020 and the things that we didn't do very well. Yes, some say it was a failure, we say no, it was implemented but partly. Now, what made us fail to implement the other part? So there were several things that review brings out. First of all, connecting the political and the economic is the issue of sometimes there were instances of political short-termism. So the transition from one administration to the other, kind of made a restart every time in terms of development planning and the implementation of the same. Not only that, you had instances where the operationalizing strategies, in this case, the Malawi growth and development strategies, at times did not speak to the overarching long-term development agenda. And that restart, kept recurring, and so on and so forth. So I think as a country, when we sat down in 2017, we introduced an act that would address these two things and created a commission with a twofold mandate. Firstly, an apolitical quasi-government entity that would take over development planning so that the inconsistencies and the implementation breaks that we have could be dealt with. So that going forward, you would have a Malawi that continuously pursues its development agenda, irrespective of what happens. But not only that, and I think one of the saddest criticisms we receive as a commission, and it has gotten too odd, is Malawi, we develop the most impressive development plans, but we are very bad at implementation. I think if we go to our frequently asked section on our website, that will probably be one of the tops. But the country sat down again and said, okay, fine. So this is a really big deal. How do we deal with this? Let us create a commission with a mandate that will be given the responsibility to oversee the implementation of development planning, so that as we plan for a long-term and inclusively, apolitical development framing for the country, this will also be followed through in the same spirit. So that gives you the transition in terms of development planning, the political economic framing of development going forward, and speaks to some of the elements that pop up. For instance, at local government, we support the development of medium to long-term development planning, and that's a national level. But that has to translate at the subnational level. And being able to effectively, localize and trickle that down, because that's where implementation actually happens. Dr. Chingaipe talked about the implementation of neoliberal economic policy at the local level not being done effectively. And that's something that, if you look at the development framing, and from Dr. Munthali's presentation, he talked about the developmental state philosophy, where every economy is obviously a mixed economy. There's a part of it that's state-led, there's a part of it that's market-oriented. But it should not necessarily be one or the other. It's part how the interplay of that is allowed to progress that will give you the results. So the developmental state philosophy carries that understanding at the back of its mind at the national level, and even how we localize development planning at the local level. And again, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I think that speaks into part of how we're envisioning implementation of the pillars, especially in agriculture, productivity, and commercialization as we go forth. What type of developmental framing should we have that gives us a consistent framing, but also gives us a consistent implementation and is able to have a real-time troubleshoot for where we get it wrong as a country. So, I mean, let me stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Salim. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. Yes, please.
I want to build on what he's saying, on how do we build on the agriculture side. And then I want to also to build on this behavior of short-termism. It's so deep in our culture, such that we build things to break them. You see it reflected in how we are handling the VSL, the village savings. At the end of the year, they save, and then we go in and distribute. So I wanted to say that we need to start to handle everything as a business. I think Steve also handled that. Everything that we do, whether it's farming, whether it's politics, we need to have a business-oriented approach. I think yes, the social part has to be handled, but with social programs. But if we are going to move, we need to start reinforcing the investments. So the smallholder farmer that we are working with in the cooperatives, let them not be gathering institutions, because as it stands, the cooperatives that we have, they just count numbers. Like you're like, oh, how many are you in this? It's like that's the achievement. For me, I want to see cooperatives that are going to run as businesses. And what do I mean when I say ring fencing the investment? So when they start to save, let them invest that money. So year in, year out, you're not saying by the end of the year we share. No. If at all there is need to share, let them only share dividends. But whatever they get, let them reinvest, so that by year 10, that business should have grown and become a manufacturing industry or some industry of some sort. But if we continue with this habit, because it's coming from the political side, planning, the development side, we are all planning to end it and then restart. The type of investment or the amount of effort that it takes to mobilize and start is wasted just because of this type of approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do you want to come?
I just have very quick comments on one on Dr. Chingaipe's and one on Dr. Salim's contributions, where Dr. Chingaipe said local government elections were not happening left to themselves, and it had to be tied to parliamentary and presidential, because only then, the presidential and parliamentary candidates would, in their own interest, make sure these elections happen. In this process, what's happening is the local ownership and participation gets killed. And I would say this also happening at the macro political institutions level, where we say that, oh, parliament would not do this, and then another arm of government, the judiciary, jumps in. And this is a very dangerous trend for democracy, because each institution has to play a role. If one institution is pushing one to play its role, then I think there is a power imbalance that can lead to some very difficult situations. And Salim pointed out about the developmental philosophy that was in the director's speech. In this discussion on developmental philosophy, we also very mindfully tried democratic developmental state. That's what the vision says. And I have been engaging with some youth leaders in the past years in training programs, and there is this thinking that we have to take the developmental part. Some amount of autocracy will help to take the developmental processes, and they are taking examples from some of the countries that have really done very, very well with some level of autocracy. So there is this kind of a thinking coming in that democracy cannot really help developmental processes. So there is, I think, a wider discussion needed on what is democratic development state, because there is a danger that the gains that we have made in democracy can be lost if that understanding, is not really internalized and transmitted to the grassroots. I thought I wanted to make these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that those are really, really interesting remarks, and I think that part of what the challenges that we're seeing today is because we had a lot of hopes in democracy in general, and sometimes people believe that democracy didn't deliver. And I'm going to take now on the DG's words about going into action. So then Malawi has transformed somehow. But what, Dr. Henry, what transformations are yet to be seen, and they are deeply needed?
Transformations that are yet to be seen. One is the level of poverty. We still have a big problem there, and I know we will have this one for some time, and we do need to find better ways of dealing with the poverty. Not just helping people live with poverty and survive poverty, but to actually get people out of poverty. Because close to half or more than half of the population still live in poverty. The other transformation that we desire, we are yet to see, and I think it's getting worse, is the inequality, income inequalities. Less than 10% of the population, when we look at some of the data, suggests that less than 10% of the population actually have 90% of the income. And that means that the income inequality is very big, and the inequalities create all sorts of tensions in society, and some play out, and people usually find simple things to blame or to explain them, but the core of it is actually something to do with the inequality. The other thing that we hope for, but we have not seen as transformation, is the patrimonial exercise of state power. You know, when people in authorities want to look like big fathers, and all of us are children, and you know the relationship between children and dad, you know, and that affects accountability processes. That also creates, you know, a good amount of impunity and so on. So it's a kind of transformation that we really need to look at. We also want to see a transformation in terms of the role of the state in the economy. You see, before the 1992-94 period, the role of the state in the economy was very active. If we have to use technical jargon, it was the demiurge role. The state was involved in production and provision of public goods and services, and not just public goods and services, even private goods, because the state ran companies. Now, with the transition, then market-oriented neoliberal policies, privatization issues, and so on, the state withdrew almost haphazardly from the economy and left huge gaps. Now, we do expect the state to promote private sector growth, and to create an environment in which wealth creation by private initiatives actually work. But we haven't created the kind of state that should be able to do that. Now, in the end, we just have some kind of a residual state that polices, enforces law when it is necessary or when it sees fit. But we know from development history and practice from many other regions, including East Asia, that if you take out the role, the demiurge role of the state, you must empower the state to play a midwifery role. The state should be able to contribute to the birthing of new entrepreneurial groups, new enterprises, and so on. The state must acquire the capacity and the role of a husband to help private sector engage in more challenging production. Okay? If you want a computer producing company in Malawi, you need the state to help. I think these are the lessons we learn from Latin America, from East Asia, and so on. In our case, the state withdrew and withdrew almost completely with a few glimpses of light here and there. And I think we do need to make it more consistent. A midwifery and a husbandry role for the state to support economic activity and economic revitalization of the country. I will stop there.
So much. I know that they're keen, some people are keen to ask for questions. I'm going to ask the last question, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions to the panelists. So you were talking about interventions and productivity. So how, and considering agriculture plays a key role, so Nangava, how and what interventions can we implement in agriculture to take people out of poverty, out of subsistence agriculture to commercial farming?
I would start with the smallholder farmers. For me, a quick win is, let's go back. The report talks about irrigation. When we go throughout Malawi, there are some irrigation schemes. At the moment, they are in poor state. Like Lifu, I was in Salima just this weekend. It's only not even a third that is being used now, but it's very close to the Lake Malawi. So much water, yet the system is corrupt. How do why not reinvest there and mobilize the farmers to start utilizing those irrigation schemes? In Kalonga, they are all over, but it has to come with the state supporting them with putting a system that they are going to manage it as a business, just the way I already highlighted. On the other hand, the SMEs, I think for me the challenge becomes because we lump them all together. They are different sizes. So the state should understand the micro ones, what do they need? The medium scale, what do they need? Because the medium scales are positioned as the aggregators, but they need financing. When we go to the banks as SMEs, I think they still have a very ideal institution, because SMEs are not fully grown as a corporate institution. So the financing institutions should be helped to understand by the state, of course, because the state is a referee to manage our relationships between the banks and us. But they should be helped to understand that as we go to seek the financing, we are not going to go there perfectly, 100%. We are going to go there with our weaknesses. That's where also the roles of the incubation centers, there are institutions like CIMID, they need to step up, because the SMEs are coming up, the entrepreneurs are coming up to do something, but they need to step up and start giving those such services that will make us move. The need for mechanization cannot be emphasized in this process, but we also need to now see the institutions like TVETA coming up with practical solutions. The types of technicians that are coming out of TVETA, are they responding to the need on the market? Because we see them all making windows. Who is making the machines that the agriculture sector needs? We need to move. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna open the floor for 2 or 3 questions.
So thank you very much. My name is Jacob Mazalale. I have a comment on the report, and I would first of all like to thank you for this report. I want to start with the video that Steve showed. The gentleman being interviewed in the video said something I think that is very important, and that's where I want to start from. So he says that Mabungu amena matandiza antu amena alibechi tandizo. And I'll translate as those organizations that help people who don't have help. Now, we've discussed that we attained democracy 20 years, or about 20 years ago. People think that there are people who don't have help. I think this, and I wrote a comment that this is an indictment on all that we have been doing for the past 20 years. People feel helpless. I think it is really very important for us to reflect on this. And it is a very genuine concern that each of us need to think. So the question is, are we helping that man? Even what we're doing here, are we helping? Now, I wanted to come to, and I want to marry that with the report that I think Steve presented on agriculture. We are talking of aggregation, connectedness, and the like. With that in mind, if we look at the IHS, this is the Living Measurement Survey of the World Bank, it talks of very shocking figures. It talks of one, of course, we have, I think, 85% of the households are living in a rural area. And most of these are farmers. Now, if you look at the data there, you realize that we have a problem. We're talking, if I come to the point of connectedness, the plots that households are cultivating, the report says the average plot size is 1.3 acres of land. Among all the plots that are cultivated, the plots of the size 0 to 1 acre amount to 48% of all cultivated land, all cultivated plot units. Now I'm asking the question, if we want to export, what type of exports can we grow in a land that is broken down into minute pieces? Because I know that we can do things on an acre's piece of land, but what type of exportation or connectedness? So you want me to carry my 2 grains of bean, and then my brother here takes 2 grains, and then we start exporting? I think these are the questions that we really need to go back to the people and listen. We need to go back and listen. Now, I could have said a lot about the data. It says that of the households plots, 0.8% is irrigated. 0.8, less than 1% is irrigated. Now, so that's that about agriculture production. I think we need to seriously think about these things. And let us come out of our nice chairs and literally listen to that man. Maybe before I go to the second point, if we look at that man, the question we need to ask is, what is he crying for? Not what we think, but what is he actually crying for? Are we putting in place a policy setup, framework that will actually help him? Not some complicated, registration of mining and whatever, but if you look at the sweat that he's exuding then, what can we do to support him? Now, just a small one. Steve showed that Malawi fluctuated, I think at some point we were 123, we went to 131 in terms of ranking, and then we are at 129 or something. I was wondering, because you're saying pathways to prosperity, what changed over that period? Maybe it's something that we can think of, because then we can learn. I like the discussion that is here, that, okay, 20 years, we promised people that let's go into democracy and the prosperity will come. Why has it not come? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Sorry, I know that there is a lot of questions, but I know that we already passed quite a lot the time. So now there is a lunch. So I would maybe encourage you to join and discuss these topics throughout the tables, etc. And we're going to be also available during the entire week to discuss. But I would like to invite Stephen for maybe some quick closing remarks. Just you can, I think, stay here and thank you so much. I'm sorry for not taking more questions.
Thank you, Maria Jose, and to all the esteemed guests here and Director General, really appreciate your contributions. The I think the discussion has really just got going, so I'm hoping over lunch we can continue. And on that last question, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Part of the reason we showed the video was to bring everybody's attention to some of the more severe challenges. But one of the things that we have to think about, and the Director General touched on it in terms of urbanization. And urbanization, of course, is sort of one level the attractive side of it. The other side of it is sort of depopulation of the rural areas. And that's a slightly less attractive way of describing the same phenomenon. But we have to think through, how do you also manage that such that actually people can leave their areas and go to the towns. If we think that's the right answer, and history shows in general that's the trend of progress, but actually it's not just making sure there are sewage facilities and buildings in urban areas to accommodate, but actually the departure route itself has to work. And that also talks to making sure land rights are working well, so that actually if people have value in their land, they've got some way of releasing it to make that journey, so that two farms could combine to something slightly bigger. But it's actually the unraveling of the the rural fabric in a way that is thinking about the humanity and the dignity of the individuals is really important to facilitate the urbanization that Director General talked about. I'll leave it at that as another idea perhaps we could discuss over lunch. And thank you all for your time, your participation. We really enjoyed seeing you all. And again, thank you to everybody who helped contribute and support us in the production of the report. And I look forward certainly to tracking with everybody here and that party in 2030. Sounds like a good one. Thank you.